Hello everyone, welcome to the channel Top Gate. In this video of operating system lecture series, we'll be discussing preemptive and non-preemptive CPU scheduling. In the previous video, we have seen what is a CPU scheduling, and in this one we'll see what is the difference between a non-preemptive and a preemptive scheduling. So let's start with the video. So the first point says that the CPU scheduling is of two types. One is a preemptive scheduling and one is a non-preemptive scheduling. Now, what is the preemptive and what is the non-preemptive? So I'll first start with the non-preemptive one and then I'll tell you what is a preemptive one. A non-preemptive scheduling is a scheduling in which if a process is executing on the CPU, then this process will never leave the CPU unless and until it completes its work. So if a process is executing on the CPU, if it starts execution on the CPU, it will not leave the CPU unless and until its work is completed. Only this process can voluntarily leave the CPU. No process can forcefully take the CPU from this process, whether the process is a high priority process or it is a low priority process, but any process can never forcefully take the CPU from this process if we are following a non-preemptive CPU scheduling technique. Fine. Now, just opposite to this one, there is a preemptive scheduling. The preemptive scheduling says that suppose if a process is getting executed by the CPU and while it was getting executed, suddenly a high priority process comes. This high priority process comes and it tells to the operating system that I am a more high priority process. I need to execute right now. So the operating system will see everything, and if it agrees to its request, then what it will do, it will remove the low priority process from the CPU and send it to the waiting state and execute this high priority process. So in preemptive scheduling, a process comes for the execution on the CPU, then again it leaves the CPU, again goes to the waiting state, again it comes to the CPU, again goes to the waiting state, again it comes to the CPU, again it goes to the waiting state, and so on. And finally, it completes its work on the CPU burst only. So let's discuss this pointwise. So the first point says that the CPU scheduling is of two kinds. One is a preemptive one, one is a non-preemptive one. That is clear. Second point, it says that in non-preemptive scheduling, when a CPU is allocated to a process, it will not leave the CPU unless and until it is. So it is saying that the process will never leave the CPU, but it can only leave the CPU in two situations. First thing is when this process is either completed. So if it is completed, then it will definitely leave the CPU. So it will leave the CPU unless and until it is completed. So in one case, it will leave the CPU. Second case, it goes to the waiting state for doing input output. Suppose the process is there and this process, it desperately needs some input output devices. So it cannot do its work on the CPU. So it is the process who is willingly leaving the CPU. Clear? So we can say that in non-preemptive scheduling, the process will never leave the CPU unless and until it is completed or it is going to the waiting state for doing input output. That is, the operating system or any other process, they can never forcefully take the CPU from this process in non-preemptive scheduling. Clear? Third point, the non-preemptive process only voluntarily leaves the CPU. That is, I made this point very clear that in non-preemptive scheduling, it is the process who is voluntarily leaving the CPU. No process can forcefully take the CPU from this process. Clear? Fourth point. Now, in preemptive scheduling, if a process is getting executed by the CPU and a high priority process comes, then the OS will take the CPU from this low priority process and executes the high priority process. Fine. So this is called as a preemptive scheduling. That is, a process is getting executed. Suddenly a process came and it informed to the operating system that it is a very high priority process. It needs to complete its work at that very moment. So the OS, if it grants its request, it will take the CPU from the earlier process and it will grant the access of CPU to this high priority process. So it will execute first and the process which was executing earlier will go to the waiting state. And when this high priority process completes its work or it goes to the waiting state, then that process which was executing will be again transferred back to the CPU. So that is in one case. But in another case, when we are doing round robin scheduling algorithm, we'll be discussing round robin in detail in the next maybe after 2-3 videos. So in round robin, we have a time quantum. That is, a process can only execute for a time quantum. That is, suppose the process has a burst time, has the execution time of 4 time units, but the time quantum is 2. That means this process cannot execute for more than 2 time units. However, its execution time is 4 time units, but then also in one stretch it will only execute for 2 time units. That is the value of the time quantum. So it will execute for the time quantum value, and then it has to leave the CPU in that case. So that is the case of preemptive scheduling. So let's discuss a brief comparison of the preemptive and the non-preemptive scheduling. So I will give you some points that shows the comparison of the preemptive with the non-preemptive scheduling. The first point says that in preemptive scheduling, it has overheads of scheduling the processes. So that means, since in preemptive scheduling we are switching the CPU from one process to another very frequently, therefore every time we are switching the process, it adds to the overhead in that scheduling. So we are adding some overhead. Why overhead? Because every time we are switching the CPU from one process to another means we are doing a context switch. Context switch means suppose there is one process getting executed in the CPU. If we have to take the CPU from this process and take another process on the CPU, then what we'll do, we will save the state of this current process in its PCB and then reload the state of the next process from its PCB and then try to execute on that CPU. Now after again this old process is trying to come on the CPU, we'll again save the state of the previous process in its PCB and reload the state of this new process in its PCB. So every time we are doing a context switch, we are actually adding a overhead. But in non-preemptive, as opposed by the preemptive one, it has no overheads. Why? Because we are not doing the context switch very frequently, therefore the overhead that we have, it can be ignored as compared to this preemptive one. Second one, in preemptive scheduling, the CPU utilization is high. What does that mean? Since we are trying to keep the CPU as busy as possible, so in this case, since we are continuously trying to execute the process one after the another, we are doing the context switch every time, so the CPU is very busy in this case. It will never sit idle in most of the times, and most of the times it will be busy executing the processes. So we can say the CPU utilization is high in this case, and that is a very good thing. In non-preemptive, the CPU utilization is low as compared to the preemptive scheduling. Third point says that waiting time in preemptive scheduling is less. Now what is the waiting time? Waiting time is the time for which the process is waiting in the ready queue for its turn to be executed. So suppose the process comes in the ready queue. Coming in the ready queue means that the process is now ready to begin the execution. But since there may be some other process which is getting executed by the CPU, therefore this process is not able to execute on the CPU. So the time for which it is not getting its turn on the CPU and it is there in the RAM, it is there in the ready queue, that time can be called as the waiting time. Fine. So in preemptive scheduling, since we are doing the context switch very frequently, therefore the waiting time of the processes is very less, and that is a very good thing in this case. Clear? Now, the third point in non-preemptive says the waiting time is high. Now, why waiting time is high? Waiting time is high because suppose there is a process which has a higher burst time, which very large burst time. So it is getting executed. While it is getting executed on the CPU, every other process which is waiting which is there in the RAM will be waiting for its turn. But the CPU will not be given to those processes unless and until this executing process leaves the CPU. So while this process is executing on the CPU, every other process will be waiting in the ready queue. That is why the waiting time of the process is very high in this case. Fourth one, the fourth point says the response time is less. Now what is the response time? Response time says the time at which the CPU gives the first response to a process. That is the time at which the CPU executes the process for the very first time. Fine, and that is less in this case. Less means the process is actually waiting for a less period of time in the RAM, therefore it is getting the response time as very less. And as opposed to this one, it says that the response time is high. Why response time is high? Because we are following the non-preemptive approach. If a process is getting executed by the CPU, it will not leave the CPU unless and until it is completed. So while it is getting executed, every other process will be waiting for their first response from the CPU, and the response time will eventually be very high. And the fifth point says that this algorithm is very flexible. Why flexible? Because we have so many processes to execute, and we are giving the time to every process to execute. But in this one, it is very rigid. That is, we are not giving time to every process. Many processes are waiting for their turn. Some are getting executed. So it is very rigid, and this one is very flexible. So hope this concept is very clear to you now. So thank you so much.